One of the natural dream matches people will want for Bryan is to take on Kenny Omega. After all, with Bryan's reputation as one of the best to ever do it and Kenny Omega's reputation as one of the best workers in his generation, it's something that many people will naturally want to see. What would happen if these two men, known for their ring work, finally get the chance to have a big-time match? The answer is
hot shit! Oh my god, bitch!
What an amazing affair that was, huh? Kenny Omega vs. Bryan Danielson is one of the best dream matches to have actually happened. And I don't mean to invalidate or come off as ignorant of their 2009 match. I'm aware of it, and it's a fun match on its own. But I'd still classify their 2021 matchup as a dream match, because both Bryan and Omega are at very different stages in their careers. Omega has developed immensely in the ring, and Bryan continues to prove that he hasn't lost his edge as he's grown older. This match comes off as more of what most fans would imagine a dream match between the two to look like. They're both great, but completely different from one another.
Wrestler in the entire world. He knows that he's got to pace himself, and we're off to the races.
And as the 30-minute epic concluded, I couldn't help but be reminded of another match from a few years ago. A match that featured two of the top wrestlers from within their respective fan bases and promotions. A babyface with ungodly selling abilities, brutal striking, and a well-protected heel. As a result of these similarities, I had no other choice than to go back and rewatch one of my all-time favorite wrestling matches. Brock Lesnar versus Daniel Bryan.
You ain't no saving me, ain't no saving me or you.
2018 marked a historic year for Daniel Bryan. Making his in-ring return at WrestleMania 34, Bryan had sent the wrestling world into a frenzy, with potential dream matches being shared left and right. Even WWE got in on the fun by uploading a list of their own. So with all of this hype coming out of WrestleMania, what was Bryan's first comeback feud? Oh. Yeah, least to say that Bryan's return to wrestling was met with a less than stellar output of matches, beating Big Cass on 2 lackluster pay-per-view occasions, a brief return of Team Hell No, and then having a lifeless feud with The Miz from August all the way to the beginning of November. Saying this was a disappointment is almost underselling it. WWE was going through a boom period with NXT before its eventual drop-off in quality, which on its own offers plenty of dream opportunities, if not for Bryan also offering up his own ideas for potential opponents. So it was quite sad to see that instead of giving us feuds with guys like Finn Balor or Nakamura, we got Big Cass and Miz feuds for the entirety of spring through fall. And while Bryan did his best to work in these conditions, like implementing a heel hook and a more grappling-based style to deal with the size of Big Cass, it wasn't enough to make these matches anything more than forgettable for me. However, a bright spot did begin to shine towards the beginning of November, wherein Bryan wrestled AJ Styles on 2 occasions for the WWE title. Both matches follow a story that's geared to sell Bryan's heel turn in their second match. The basic summary of their first match goes as follows. Bryan targets the arm of AJ, and AJ targets Bryan's knee. All the while they trade off signature maneuvers in between. In the end, AJ forces Bryan to tap out, and they end the night with a showing of respect. The selling is sold effectively on both sides, with Styles using a couple riskier maneuvers that ended up paying off. This sold to me that the outcome was in AJ's favor, and on top of that, Bryan alludes to a change in demeanor through his facial expressions, and we get one of the best Styles clashes ever. It all adds up to this being a great prelude to what's to come later.
I didn't just beat Daniel Bryan, I tapped him out.
In 2 weeks' time, Bryan confronts Styles once again on SmackDown. Accepting the outcome of their match, he offers up some newfound aggression, claiming that he'd punch Styles in the face if he chose to utter his name again. So once AJ did, Bryan made good on his word.
Daniel Bryan attacking the WWE Champion!
The match is confirmed for the main event as a title match, and now we have the setup. Following into the match, we see it start on a similar note to their first matchup, with Styles deciding to go after Bryan's knee. Bryan decides to change course and he throws him violently off the top of the rope. And after this point, you see something change in Daniel Bryan. A slight grin goes across his face, if just for a moment, and after that point he goes into an absolute onslaught, throwing AJ into the turnbuckle posts, and then reprising many spots and maneuvers that we saw in their first matchup. But there's a lot more intensity here. With every move, Bryan seems to be throwing himself into AJ, communicating that anger we felt as AJ gloated about his victory over Bryan earlier in the night. Almost as if Bryan's aggression is fueling him through this match. He counters each big move that Styles throws at him. From the calf crusher to the springboard 450 to the phenomenal forearm, Bryan has an answer for everything. And eventually this results in Bryan low-blowing AJ, but not out of desperation as usually goes in wrestling. This was more out of opportunity. At this stage in the match, Bryan didn't need to hit a low blow, he just felt like he could. The ref was down and the opportunity was there, so why not take it? I mean, we see the exact same thing later in the Brock Lesnar match, which will be touched upon, so you could even say it's foreshadowing towards that. Bryan will not shy away from using a dirty tactic if it gets him closer to victory. And though cheap and heelish, you could just as easily argue that it's a smart tactic, as it prones AJ for his finishing maneuver. As AJ crawls back to his feet, we get my favorite moment from this match. A zoomed in portrait of Bryan's expression slowly and coldly turning into a blood-red rage, twisting into the dastardly heel that we would see in the weeks following this.
In trouble! The running knee! Over! Daniel Bryan!
Attacking Styles after the match, Daniel Bryan cements himself as a heel going into his match with Lesnar at Survivor Series, demonstrating that he is willing to dig back into his American Dragon persona as a man who will shed audience validation and safety in order to use sadistic violence and cheap shots in an effort to stand on top of his competition. If there's one thing that connects both Bryan and Brock's 2018 runs together, it's starting off weak and ending strong, though more so in Bryan's case than for Brock. It's difficult for me to say that anything before Survivor Series is worth revisiting from Lesnar's 2018 run. It stings that much more when Lesnar only showed up a handful of times, starting with a triple threat at Royal Rumble, a disheveled mess that devolved into Strowman catching a couple receipts.
A knee to the jaw! He caught Lesnar good!
Following this, we saw Brock compete in a couple more title defenses against Roman Reigns in a match with Braun Strowman. And although I could go through each of these affairs, they all boil down to the same fundamental problem for me, which is that when Brock is not facing someone smaller in stature, it only makes his moveset look less impressive and tends to leave a lot to be desired from a storytelling aspect. Now there's some obvious exceptions to this, like his matches with Kurt Angle or John Cena, but when you're not dealing with guys that are exceptional in the ring on their own, bigger guys tend to fall into that same dull match structure, where the appeal comes from seeing these monsters among men throw everything they have at each other. And unless you want to go down the road of strong style or a King's Road style of wrestling, then what you end up with is about 10 minutes of finisher spamming and 10 more minutes of mat selling, which when kept short can be surprising and endearing for what it is, like in the case of Goldberg and Lesnar's matches. But if you go at a traditional match length, the gimmick gets old really fast. A problem that was pervasive in Lesnar's 2018 run. However, on the bright side, if you look at Brock's 2018 in hindsight, it ties into the Bryan match very nicely. As Brock loses the title to Reigns at the SummerSlam pay-per-view, it gives Brock his first loss since losing to Goldberg at Survivor Series all the way back in 2016, leaving Lesnar in this really weird limbo until Reigns announced his leukemia diagnosis, which left the Universal title vacant and up for grabs, leading to a match between Strowman and Lesnar at Crown Jewel. He defeats Strowman in swift fashion and heads into Survivor Series right after. Now, where Bryan goes into Survivor Series hot off a couple of great matches with AJ Styles, being on the precipice of what was to be a fantastic heel run, and just picking up the WWE title, Bryan feels not only rejuvenated from his stale comeback run, but there's also a sense of excitement and uncertainty, while Lesnar feels to me like he's only begun to build his reputation back up, with all of his matches from that year falling flat alongside his winning streak. Heading into Survivor Series, it felt vital that he shined here, and best case scenario being that he picks up a win in the process.
Daniel Bryan goes right after the knee of Brock Lesnar.
Paying off on the uncertainty angle of his newfound attitude, Bryan's strategy in the opening of the match is oddly playful, attempting a dropkick to the leg of Lesnar, akin to the strategy AJ Styles went for in the year prior. But when that doesn't go as planned, Bryan decides to evade Brock Lesnar and play a game of cat and mouse. Finding it charming at first, it doesn't take long for the Beast to grow annoyed at Bryan's games.
Brock Lesnar, here's the ticket.
Suplex City!
Oh, God! German suplex released.
Daniel.
It had been less than a year since Bryan had been cleared to wrestle after sustaining career-ending neck injuries, so to repeatedly watch Bryan land on his neck and back with suplexes this devastating is hard to watch, for lack of a better term. Especially the first one. I mean, from the landing to the whimpering struggle for air found in Bryan's selling, the match goes from lighthearted to uncomfortable, immediately building sympathy for Daniel Bryan as you hear the mood drop in the arena, the shock and awe from the crowd serving as the backdrop to Bryan's torture.
And now another one.
As Brock drags Bryan's lifeless carcass across the ring, we're reminded of just the kind of man Brock Lesnar is. Someone who delights in the suffering of others. Paying no mind to Bryan's condition, he tosses him about for minutes on end.
And now another one by his head. And again! And I think he's going to do it all night long. Another exceptional one kick and another throw by Brock Lesnar. This is what you... And now Bryan is driven into the barricade. Ever forget. God, into the... I mean, I know Daniel Bryan wouldn't want the match stopped, but at some point the referee's going to have... Just take out Daniel Bryan a final time with an F5! Good.
Only stopping to admire the damage that he's caused. And even when we think he's about to end this suffering and pin Daniel Bryan, it's only to stop the count and remind us that the match, or in this case the slaughter, doesn't stop until Brock says that it does. With concern over what match dynamic we were going to get, seeing as how they were both established heels now, this angle not only works perfectly to establish the heel and face dynamics of the match, but it amplifies it to an insane degree of seriousness. Now at this stage of the match, Bryan is done. How could you argue otherwise after watching Brock unleash hell on Bryan for 7 minutes? Well, if there's one thing any fan of the American Dragon knows, it's that he is one of the best at employing
Fighting spirit.
I think he got Bryan again with a kick, and Brock has been knocked down.
What's notable about the use of fighting spirit in wrestling is to me what it signifies thematically speaking. It's a sign of life, and with 2 kicks, Bryan gives us all we need to reassure us that he's not out of this fight yet.
Official, Daniel Bryan with a low blow! Blow! The referee knocked down, didn't see it! Daniel Bryan with a running knee! Down! Covered by Bryan! Cover! Got it! Kick out of 2! Oh my God!
And just like that, the roles have been firmly established. Brock's sadistic nature and overwhelming strength gives the audience little reason to sympathize with him, while Daniel Bryan's complete defenselessness and eerily convincing selling creates a great deal of support behind him. And add on top of that the aura of real-life concussions looming over everyone's head, and the suspense surrounding this match is undeniable. Also, before we continue and before I get any comments mentioning this, yes, I'm aware that Daniel Bryan didn't actually retire from WWE because of his concussions. He's now stated that it's because he lied to WWE. We know that now. In this video, I'm addressing how my perspective was shaped by the match at the time, and at the time we all thought the concussions were the cause, which is what makes the match so effective. Anyways, now that that's out of the way, back to the video. It's one of the most sneaky and effective uses of a face turn that I've seen employed in a wrestling match. The impact of Brock's moveset perfectly conveys his unbridled brutality and lack of empathy, while also instilling within the audience a powerful sense of sympathy. It's impressive how much these two were able to convey with what on paper is just an elongated, one-sided affair. But it's within this execution that we see just how brilliant these two are together, creating the perfect storm around Bryan to shift our perspective on him from heel to face. And speaking of that, something else that Bryan does in this match that I love is how he's able to come across as a babyface in order to sell the match and invest the audience, but all the while he never loses sight of his heel persona. He still takes every advantage that is presented to him, no matter how many rules he has to break or how violent he must become in order to do so. which were the two staple factors that we saw turn him heel in his last match against AJ Styles. But the reason why this works and it doesn't make him as a character feel conflicted or the audience feel conflicted on how they should be watching this match is because the cheap shots and aggressive tactics feel necessary if Bryan has any hope in beating Lesnar, which is a feat that so few have been able to lay claim to since Lesnar's return back in 2012.
Can we pretend that airplanes in the night sky like shooting stars?
And since they did such an effective job putting over Brock in the first half of the match, by the time Bryan's able to actually get some offense in, the audience is craving to see Brock get taken down a peg. As from this point on, Bryan trades between smart counters and pummeling strikes in order to break down Brock's defenses. While still never losing sight of his own fatigued state, they trade risky spots that don't pay off in either of their intended favors.
Suicide dive, Lesnar caught him again, and this time Bryan pays by Brock Lesnar. But now,
highlighting Bryan being a bit too overzealous in the midst of his comeback sequence, and a growing frustration on Brock that quickly turns into foolishness. As they make their way back into the ring, Bryan hits another running knee, but it's unable to put Brock away.
for the victory, hooks the leg of the beast and powers out at 2.
With his big signature move not seeming to do the job at this point in the match, Bryan combines two of his earlier strategies together, one by going after Brock's knee, this time being successful in this endeavor, and a high-risk maneuver in the form of a missile dropkick connecting to the chest of Brock. His fighting spirit is now exploding from his body as he attempts 3 corner dropkicks, but he goes to the well one too many times and finds himself caught in the F5. But Lesnar crumbles under his own weight, emphasizing Bryan's limb work and how that's paying off in the match, thereby giving Bryan an opportunity to lock in the label lock. Altogether, it's such a well put together sequence that highlights to us the damage Brock has taken thus far and that it has actually had an effect on his ability to continue wrestling in the match. Being at the mercy of Daniel Bryan, Brock still is able to find the strength to place Bryan in a position for a hobbled F5, selling his injury all the way to the end. Brock Lesnar vs. Daniel Bryan is a match that succeeds in re-establishing both of its wrestlers. Brock Lesnar leaves Survivor Series in a much better place than he was coming into it. He's been re-established as a dominating monster who will do anything and everything to get the victory. As for Bryan, he moves on to go into one of his best arcs. As a stuck-up environmentalist, he'll not only have one of his best years, but he'll also revitalize the career of Kofi Kingston, or at least help in doing so. But if we look at the match on its own, it is worth pointing out that I don't think this match is perfect. My biggest gripe is with the ending. I think that the label lock and F5 spots are both great on their own, but I do also think that the finish could have had a more effective build-up. It just sort of happens and comes out of nowhere for me, but you could also say it makes sense given how these two have spent the latter half of this match countering one move after another, so to have it end after Bryan's last big finishing move is countered actually does make some sense and is pretty cohesive with the story that they've been following up to this point, so while it does work towards the logic of the match, it does still feel a tad bit rushed to me personally. Regardless, as it stands, I think this match is a testament to what an excellent wrestler Brock Lesnar is. He's got this rap of being a boring big man who overuses suplex, which can happen in some of his matches, but to invalidate his detailed selling or how wrapped up he gets in his character is genuinely baffling to me. Bryan himself said so in an interview this year. Speaking of Bryan, I think his performance here speaks for itself. He rides a delicate balance of playing a face but never losing sight of what his new character is supposed to be. Never giving the crowd any incentive to cheer for him like you would usually see through things like the yes chants, for example. While here, Daniel Bryan communicates everything through body language and his facial expressions, which in my book is always more impressive. I didn't intend to release this right after WWE's 2021 Survivor Series, a show that seems to have left people's minds as quickly as it entered them, which is the exact opposite of what this match did just 3 years ago. It's just a funny coincidence that happened to work out. All I can say is that you should go out of your way to watch this, and to not let history leave something that teaches such a great lesson in character work and playing off audience expectations behind in the dust.